Well, you may not often think that church is a place to fight, but today I want to declare that this is the battleground. And today's the day we're going to fight as we're looking into the Word and we're looking at the message I believe God has for us. We're going through Colossians and we're looking at verse by verse what this letter teaches us about the person of Jesus, our relationship with Him. And today I want to talk with you about fighting your fears. And so if you're out there online, you can say, I'm ready to fight. You can type that in. If you're here and you would feel so brave and bold, you could say, I'm ready to fight if you're in this place today. So if you open up to Colossians chapter 3, we're going to be in verse 15 in just a few moments as we start. As we talk about and think about fighting our fears, the thing to understand about fear is it affects all of us in some form or fashion. It just does it in different ways. And so for me as a kid growing up, I had certain fears. You probably did as well. But the way fear manifests itself as an adult is a lot different than it probably was when you were 5, 6, 8 years old. The way fear can creep into our life is through things like worry, things like anxiety, things like stress, inability to allow our minds to rest. And when these worries, these anxieties, these stresses come in, they're ways that fear manifests itself into our lives. And so if you think about fear, there's two characteristics of it that I want to call your attention to. The first thing to understand about fear is this: fear is parasitic. Fear is parasitic, and what I mean by that is that it feeds off of something else. It depends on something else for its fuel. So fear is going to be something that is fueled by the unknown. It is fueled by the what if. And if you come in this morning and you say, I don't know what there is unknown in my life, I want to give you a few ways that fear can manifest itself in the following ways by asking these questions. What if, first of all, what if the economy falls apart? This is a what if that you may be asking. What if things fall apart? What if I lose my job? It's a way that fear, it's a way that anxiety can creep in. What if I'm not able to pay my bills? What if I'm able, what if? Another way that it creeps in is what if my health falls apart? What if I go to the doctor the next time and the report is not good? What if it's worse as opposed to better? This what if question fuels our fear. Pointedly to where we are right now in culture, what if I get COVID? What's going to happen? I've heard about other people contracting this, but what if it hits home with me? Now maybe this is not your fear. Maybe your fear is, what if someone I love contracts COVID? It's a way that the what if enters in. Fear is fueled by this. What if the government becomes a socialist state? Now for some of you, that's probably not a concern, but for me, it's a legitimate concern. As I look into the future and I see the trajectory of the way things are going, what if things continue moving in this direction? It leads to this what if question. What if my children, and I don't have any grandchildren, just so we're clear about this, but you probably do. Now some of you, what if my children or grandchildren grow up in a fundamentally different America? Now, can I get a little love here from those of you who are online, those of you who are here? These are valid things that you're asking the question. What if these things happen? A lot of pastors right now, I've communicated with them, and one of the common things they're talking about is, what if people don't come back? What if things continue to struggle? What if? And all of these what if type fears, they feed upon each other. So fear, first of all, understand that it's contagious, or that it's parasitic. The second thing to understand is that fear is contagious. It spreads from one person to another. And this is where I really want to fight on your behalf today. Because every time you turn on a news outlet, every time you read a newspaper, media understands this, that fear sells, fear motivates. And you're bombarded with messages from the right, from the left, all over the place that are inundating you with messages of fear. And so the question is, how do we overcome this fear? How do we fight back against it? So if we see that fear is parasitic, it is contagious, the thing we have to understand is that fear ultimately leads to control. And the reason this matters so much for your life, the reason this matters so much in your relationship with Jesus is because of this. There are two forces that are vying for control of your life. One voice is God, the other is Satan. And if control is Satan's goal, fear is Satan's strategy. If Satan can get you to fear circumstances, if he can get you to fear outcomes, if he can get you to fear disease or any other thing, if Satan can get you to fear, he can control you. And so we want to look this morning at how we become not totally fearless, but how we can fear less than we do currently. So Colossians chapter 3, beginning in verse 15, we read the words of Paul when he tells us this. He says, "Let the peace of Christ rule in your heart." And what Paul's told us already right here in verse 15 is the antidote to fear. When he talks about peace here, he's talking about an inner calm in the midst of an outer chaos. Peace that Christ brings has been described as the water that is below the surface of the waves and the storm. That on the surface everything is chaotic, yet under the surface everything is calm. That's the peace of Christ that dwells in our hearts. It's an inner calm in the midst of outer chaos. Jesus says it like this, John 14:27. He says, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you." And then we see the connection between peace and fear. When he says, "Do not let your heart be troubled, nor let it be fearful." So we see here that peace is the antidote to fear. That if we want to fight against fear, the way we do it is through peace, this inner calm that comes from Christ. I was at Home Depot a couple weeks ago. I went in and I was there to pick up something, and it just so happened as I walked up to the cash register to where it was I was going to check out, I came into the line, but I came into the line from the wrong direction. And so it was an honest mistake. I wasn't trying to do it intentionally. And so there was another person right there beside me, and we kind of walked up right at the same time. I looked at him, he looked at me, and as he looked at me, it was time for the next person to be able to go. I said, "Well, hey, go ahead. I'm not in a hurry." I wasn't in a hurry. So I said, "Hey, go ahead." And so he walks on up, and then somebody else comes up right in his place. And I'm like, "Okay, well, all right, I'll be gracious about this." And then I'm still standing there. Well, that guy goes on forward, and he goes into, when he finally gets ready to check out, and he turns around to me and he says, "Yeah, don't you know that the line starts way back there?" And I didn't know that the line started way back there. And so I look and I turn around and, oh yeah, there's like 3 more people back there. And so at that point I'm thinking, this is an honest mistake. Like, I'm not a criminal. I'm not a bad person. I've not insulted your mother or your family or anybody that you love. And so I start walking around and trying to hey, just be gracious, nice. And you should have seen the looks that people gave. It was like I had just committed some kind of terrible thing against them. But here's what I'm finding. I don't know if you've noticed this or not. With regard to what people are holding inside them, there's not a lot of peace present in our culture right now. There's a lot of frustration. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of junk that ultimately has its core root in fear. And fear, listen to me, fear is a toxic emotion. There is a reason God says so many times in both the Old and the New Testament, do not fear. And when people live in this state of fear, the state as if that they are controlled by some external force, when people are fearful, all kinds of negative, toxic junk manifests itself as a result. And that, my friends, is what we see when we look into the world. And may it not be that with us. So Paul says, let the peace of Christ, but then he goes on, he says this interesting word here. He says, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. Now this word rule, it has to do with being like an arbiter or an umpire who officiates a game. Something or someone that has the final say. And so if you've watched a baseball game and an umpire makes a call, they say a ball and the coach thinks it's a strike or whatever it is, when they do this and the coach rushes out, there's a conflict between the umpire and the coach. And you can watch, they go back and forth, and depending on how mad the coach gets, he can yell and he can fuss. But eventually what happens is that the umpire's word trumps the coach's. The umpire's authority trumps the coach's. Here's what's going to happen in our lives as we walk through this season. Fear and peace, they are going to be in conflict with one another. You will find things before you wake up tomorrow morning to be fearful about, to be worried about, to be anxious about, to wonder what's going to happen in this area. And when those things are in conflict, he says here, let the peace of Christ rule. Let the peace of Christ be the umpire whose authority and word has the final say over what's taking place in your heart. He says, let the peace of Christ rule in your heart. Now, I want you to see, if you've zoned out, I want you to zone in and see this very important connection that I believe is fascinating that Paul makes. So in verse 15, he says, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body, and be thankful. And then in verse 16, I want you to see there's a connection between the peace of Christ ruling over you and the word of Christ residing in you. Verse 16, he's told us, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. Verse 16, let the word of Christ richly dwell within you, with all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with thankfulness in your heart to God. So there's a connection here, and the central truth I want to give you from these two verses is this: that in order for the peace of Christ to rule over you, the word of Christ must reside in you. Say it another way like this, that what resides in you will determine what rules over you. You know, in the world of athletics, running, different things, there's this thing called carb loading. If you're familiar with what carb loading is, the idea is that before you go out into an event, you want to load your body up with carbs. You want to consume something that's going to fuel you. And the reason they talk about carb loading when it's done correctly is because whatever you consume, you will carry. Whatever you consume inside of you is going to make a difference in how you perform and how you're able to achieve or not achieve. The same principle is at work here. That the more we consume the Word of Christ, the more the Word of Christ resides in us, there's a direct connection to the peace of Christ ruling over us, which begs the question, do we have the word of Christ residing in us? Now, Paul uses this word richly. It's the same word that's used for referring to God when it says he is rich in mercy. It doesn't have the idea with just enough. It's not the word of Christ dwelling in you so that you know the plan of salvation. It's not the word of Christ dwelling within you so that you can quote John 3:16, or that you can quote our famous verse today, judge not lest you be judged. It's not the idea of having just enough of the word in you to barely make it into heaven. The idea is that the word of Christ is to dwell in you richly. That your heart is to be full of the word of Christ so that your heart can also be full of the peace of Christ. This is why I believe Romans 10:17 tells us faith comes by hearing, and hearing how? By the word of Christ. And so the thing that we see from this is if we want to fight fear, if we want to starve it, if we want to overcome fear with peace, the most basic way we do that is by the word of Christ dwelling in us. And that leads to our application for today. I give you 5 ways to fight your fears. The first is simply this from the text. Number 1, allow the word of Christ to dwell in you richly. The word of Christ, as it relates to your fears, will tell you this. Matthew 10, verse 28. Jesus says, do not fear those who kill the body but are unable to kill the soul. Rather, fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? And yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. But listen to this. If this word of Christ resides in you, it will help peace rule over you. But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. So listen, brother, sister, listen, friend. If you're going to fear something, Jesus tells you what to fear. Verse 31, so do not fear. You are more valuable than many sparrows. We are not to fear the one who can kill the soul, and not to fear the one who is. Verse 28. Do not fear those who kill the body but are unable to kill the soul. There's no way to edit that out. But rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. That's what we are to fear. That's what we are to fear. And so if we're thinking about here, not how to live in such a way that we're totally fearless. Because again, fear is something that can be good. It can keep us alive when it's in its proper measure. But fear is a way of life. Always asking the what if questions, that is toxic. And so if we want to become people who fear less, here's the way we do it according to this verse. You fear less when your faith in someone is greater than your fear in something. And I'll just tell you this right now. If you'll grasp this, and if you'll in your heart right now say, Jesus, help me put this word in my heart. It'll be worth the price of admission today. Because when you can learn to have more faith in someone, that's greater than your fear in something. That's what causes you to be able to fear less. And the way we do that is when the Word of Christ dwells richly in us. You see, when the Word of Christ is dwelling in us, we're hearing the voice of God, not the voice of our enemy. The voice of God has more influence. The voice of God has more control than the voice of our enemy does. And one of the best things that we can do is to allow the Word of Christ to dwell richly in us. The second way, practically, that we can fight against fear, let me say this first. When Paul goes on in verse 16, and he talks about wisdom, teaching, admonishing one another with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with thankfulness in your hearts to God. He's talking about here just the general scriptures, but also just in our everyday rhythms of life. The things that we consume into our hearts, our minds. And so I've stated here that the role of music, whether it's within this place or in your own life personally, music should lead us toward greater thoughts, not just greater emotions. Music is something that can be used to fill our hearts, fill our minds with the Word of Christ. And so that's the first way we apply it. The second way, number 2, that we fight against fear is to thank God for every good thing in your life. Now you may wonder, what does this have to do? What does gratitude have to do with fear? Well, I want to show you something fascinating in these verses. The thread that is woven through Colossians 3, 15, 16, and 17 is thankfulness. Look in verse 15. It says, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body, and be thankful. You see this word, thankful. Verse 16, let the word of Christ richly dwell within you, with all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with thankfulness in your hearts to God. Verse 17, whatever you do in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks through him to God the Father. Now, this to me is fascinating because Paul continues to emphasize gratitude here, thankfulness, in the context of peace. Why would he do that? I believe one of the core reasons is because it is hard to be grateful and fearful at the same time. If you've ever noticed in your life, when you are genuinely grateful about something, when you are expressing thanks, you're genuinely not expressing fear. When you're genuinely grateful about something, it's a great indication that fear is not ruling and reigning. And so one of the proactive ways we fight against fear is by giving thanks. This is what Paul talked about in Philippians 4 when he said, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving. Present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will guard your hearts and your mind in Christ Jesus. There's a connection between gratitude and freedom from fear. A connection between gratitude and peace. I mean, when I was first preaching, I was in my late teens. And so the way it works when you're starting out preaching, it's like anything else. You kind of start out on the lower rungs. And for me, the lower rungs were like youth groups, Wednesday night church, and Sunday night church. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, where I'm from, like Wednesday night you were at church, Sunday night you were at church. There was like no end to the amount of church that you could get. And so the way it works is if you were kind of looking like you might be a decent preacher, you might get a slot to preach on a Wednesday night. So got the slot to preach on a Wednesday night. It was great. It's fun. Well, then if you continue to improve, you make it to Sunday night. Sunday night's a little bit bigger stage, a little bit bigger platform. And if you can do okay there, then you move from JV to varsity and you get to preach on Sunday morning. And I remember the first time I ever got to preach Worcester First Baptist Church on a Sunday morning. I had transitioned from JV, now I was on varsity. And I remember sitting down in my hands, just looking, and they were just doing this. Like uncontrollably. And inside my heart, I was absolutely filled with fear. Well, it's happened over the course of time. When I come up to preach, it's still a reverent thing. It's still a holy thing. But I cannot wait to get up and to declare the living word of God to his people. And there's not a sense of fear. There's not a sense of apprehension. There's a sense of reverence, but there's not a sense of fear because I have gratitude that God would call me. If you knew who I was out of the pulpit sometimes, you would say, wow, he called you. Yes, I'm a vessel. I'm a jar of clay. That God would call me as a fallible, messed up human being to stand up here and say, this is the word of God for his people. I'm filled with gratitude, and what happens for all of us is when we live with gratitude, it tends to minimize our fear. And so we need to be thankful. If we want to live with greater peace, be grateful for the things that God's placed in your life. The third way that we can apply this is this. I've added these for you to know. Number 3 is to name the things that are making you fearful, anxious, or stressed. When you name your fears, you weaken your fears. I've told the story before about the time I was at my great-grandma's house trying to sleep in the bed with her. I was a little kid, like 4 or 5 years old, and I kept hearing this wolf growling under the bed. It scared me to death. My grandma laid down, boom, she's asleep, and all of a sudden there's a wolf under the bed. And as a little 4-year-old kid, I am just like petrified. What do I do? Well, upon reflection, as I got a little older, I thought, my grandma snored. That was not a wolf under the bed. That was her snoring. Oftentimes, when you name your fears and you really identify, this is what it is that's causing me fear, it minimizes your fears, and you realize that, oh, that's what that was. It reduces the power. It starves. It fights back against fear. Number 4 is this, and this immediately follows when you name your fear. Number 4, chase your what ifs with so whats. I love the story of Moses in Exodus 4. God's called Moses. He's got great plans for him. Moses is to be the deliverer, to represent God and lead the people out of captivity. And he's given Moses this great calling. And in Exodus chapter 4, verse 1, Moses says, but God, what if? What if? Did you know that question, what if? It's a natural question to ask. But what if is the place that God's dreams go to die? If your life and your decisions are dominated by what if, you can be sure of this, that God's plans for your life will perish in that question of what if. And while it's good to count the costs, it's good to step back every now and then and say, well, if I do this, what might happen? But if you let that what if question dominate, here's the thing about Moses and his response, is what if wasn't followed by, well, God, what if you come through in a powerful way? Notice what comes after what if. It's what if they. When you're asking that what if question, your focus is not on God and what He can do. Your focus is not on the one who is sovereign over all. When you're asking that what if question, your focus is on something finite, on something earthly, on something that doesn't have ultimate control over you. Therefore, it should not have ultimate fear over you. But when you're asking that question, when Moses, he said, what if they don't believe me? So what that what if question reveals is that you have a man-centered way of viewing the situation, not a God-centered way of viewing the situation. And this is just a diagnostic way to, in your own heart, kind of reflect and say, okay, God, am I looking more towards you or toward the circumstances? And so that what if question needs to be chased by so what? There's power and there's freedom in this. And when you realize what if, you follow that with so what? Well, what if my health falls apart? Well, so what? God's going to take care of me anyway. What if something bad happens to me or to someone I love? The so what is God still has you in His hand. He will never leave you, never will forsake you. What if this negative thing that I dread, I fear, does come to pass? Here's so what. God is still sovereign. God is still in control. God is still capable in your life. And so you chase the what ifs with so what. There's power when we do that. The last thing I'll say to you is this, is that don't quit because of your fear. Don't quit because you're afraid. And some of you, if you're looking at situations in your life right now and you're thinking, okay, should I move forward? Should I do this or should I not do this? I'm just not sure. I'm filled with a sense of fear. Don't quit what God has called you to because of fear. Again, the consistent message that God gives to His people, His children, His sons and His daughter is do not fear. And if there's something that God is calling you to directly in His Word, if there's something that God is calling you to step out in, if there's something that God is calling you to that He wants you to pursue, you need to know this. Don't quit God's calling on your life because of fear. Don't let fear win. Sometimes the best thing that you can do is to feel the fear, and this is a cliche, but it's true. It's to feel that sense of fear, to feel that sense of dread, and to say, I feel this, but I'm not going to let it stop me. I'm sitting here as a teenage boy, and my hands are shaking, and I'm scared to death, but I'm not going to let that push me away. I'm going to step into what God's call for my life is, and I'm going to see God work in a supernatural way through my weakness. And here's the encouraging news for you today. Again, our overall goal is not to live in such a way that we're totally fearless, but we can live in such a way that we fear less. And our faith in someone exceeds our fear in something. And when that happens, there may be some element of fear. There may be some element of anxiety or concern or worry. But here's the most important thing to embrace. You don't let that control you. You don't let that dictate what you do and you do not do. You let the Word of Christ that dwells in you richly to determine what you do and you don't do. You know, I started by saying that fear is parasitic, it's contagious. Here's the neat thing, so is peace. Peace, whereas fear gets its life from lies, peace gets its life from truth. Whereas fear gets its life from the enemy, peace gets our life from our Savior, from Jesus. And so when we think about fear as being parasitic, peace being parasitic, we begin feeding off of the Word of Christ. We begin allowing it to reside in us so that peace rules over us. It changes the outcome of our life. In the same way that fear is contagious, so is peace. If you become a person of peace, the peace of Christ is residing and dwelling within you, then here's what can happen in your relationships. Over the course of time, as you rub shoulders with people that you work with people that you live with, the peace of Christ is contagious and it can infect the relationships around you. We need right now the peace of Christ. The inner calm in the midst of outer chaos that says that I am a believer in Jesus and I am going to be the most grounded, peace-oriented person because I have my trust not in external circumstances. I have my trust in a God who is greater than the circumstances. So, Father,